Yeah, so yeah, my switch from real physics, basically, it was about real physics becoming surreal, I think, the kind of physics I did. I was working on high energy physics, and then after I finished, I moved to, computational neuroscience. I went to Israel for a few months, worked with Chaim Sompolinsky, then came to Harvard as a Schwartz Fellow, collaborated with a few folks over there. Then I moved to Geneva for a little bit to meet Chicklowski's group, and with them moved back to New York to Flatiron Institute. I was a research scientist there a bit, and since 2019 January, I moved to Harvard to my current position. So that's that's how it happened.
May I ask you one question?
Sure.
Why did you do that?
Do which one? Which of them?
Let's
Yeah.
talk about all the past. Yeah. So from high energy physics to statistical neuroscience.
I mean, there was to be honest, there was a few reasons. One was basically, I mean, so in my case, actually, I did have an interest of doing neuroscience from the beginning at Brown. So I got my PhD at Brown. Well, anyway, so when I joined, there wasn't positions available for me. So that interest was there. And by the time I graduated, it was pre-LHC era, and from a high energy physics point of view, I don't think there was much excitement going on. And I thought this was a time to try something new. And I had this interest in computational neuroscience. So a bunch of factors came together, and that's how it happened.
Okay, so thank you. I mean, it's important because you have really a lot of students in this series of lectures, and but I know that because I have the list of all the people who have registered, and our mailing list is, we have 900 names on our mailing list, and there is really a lot of students in progress.
And certainly, I think it was the right move, and this is a very exciting field, and a lot has happened, and things are moving very fast. And
good. We got to your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, so and I want to thank everyone for being here. I mean, there are, I don't know, maybe 10 computing free talks going on as of now, and thanks for choosing to spend your time with me. Okay, so this talk is about function approximation view on neural representation. So what do I mean? But even before talking about function approximation and neural representations, and continuing on the theme of Turkish March. So here is a Turkish word, and a not Turkish picture that goes with it. And now suppose you're learning Turkish, and I show you this image. This word is üçgen in Turkish. And obviously your task is to make an induction or conclusion about what this word means from this picture. And then you could conclude many things. I mean, you're most likely to conclude that sorry, this word means triangle. Or you could conclude that this word means blue, or you might conclude that this is an equilateral triangle, thinking that Turkish has basically has words for these sophisticated mathematical objects, or even blue equilateral triangle, you might have a word for it, and so on and so forth. That you can be very imaginative here. So, but you will choose one of these things. So this idea of so one person choosing one among many generalizations possible from, let's say, a sample or an example, is called an inductive bias, because you're making an induction, a conclusion, and while you're doing that, or we are doing that, we're biased towards certain conclusions other than the other ones, and that's probably because of our previous experiences, priors, so on and so forth. So inductive bias are these factors that guide a learner to choose one generalization over another one. And I just want to make 2 points about this, which will be important for what I'm going to say for the rest. So whenever we are generalizing, meaning that learning something from examples, right, we rely on this idea of inductive bias. So every time we make a generalization, we are relying on something like this. So it exists, it's always there. And the second point, which should be sort of intuitive, and is that the good generalization performance requires a suitable inductive bias. So in this case, the correct answer was triangle, but if you had the wrong bias, you might have concluded that this was blue, and that wouldn't be a good sort of generalization. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I want to ask this question of inductive bias in terms of neural networks, and particularly the idea of function approximation. So here's an experiment. So let's just take this to bare bones and ask the following thing. So this neural network has 2 hidden layers and, I don't know, 100 units of neurons in each. I have an input that's a scalar x and a now output that's a scalar y of x. And I just give this 2 data points to this network, right? So these are these red dots over here. And I'm going to train this 10,000 parameter neural network to fit 2 points, okay? So that might seem like a crazy exercise. I have 10,000 parameters. I mean, I have 2 data points. It's against everything that, our statistical statistician friends might be telling us. What might happen? And this is a very powerful machine. It might fit all sorts of, curves to these 2 points. Something crazy is very likely to come out of this. And another word I'm going to use is this word of over-parameterized or over-parameterization, meaning meaning that I have more parameters than data. So you can take this and basically put it to your favorite neural network training, I don't know, software, TensorFlow, whatever. Okay, and so here's what happens. So basically, this network seems to fit almost aligned to these 2 points, right? So the idea that so these 2 points are the ones that I trained them with. Okay, these were basically, the network was instructed to fit them. And anything in between and beyond are basically network's predictions, meaning I give those x's and measure what the output is, and that's what this network produces. And I want to emphasize again that this network could have done many other fits to these 2 points, but it does seem that it chooses a simple explanation of data rather than other explanations. So there is some kind of an Occam's razor kind of a principle going on over here, right? So I'm choosing this simple explanation than the other ones. So this questions, so the point I want to make is neural networks are strongly biased towards simple functions. And this talk is going to be about figuring out what does that strongly means and what does simple means for a neural network. What's a simple function and what do we mean by being strongly biased towards it? And this will have something to do with neural representations, and that's going to come up. Just to add to the sort of mystery here. So here's the same thing, same experiment done with networks with different widths, okay? So this one had basically only one, by width I mean how many neurons I have in each hidden layer. This one had like 1 neuron per layer. This one had 10,000, 100, 1,000, and the number of parameters goes like to the square of basically those numbers. And surprisingly, perhaps, I mean, to me, it was at least, you find as you increase parameters, simpler and simpler fits, meaning more, and in this case, more and more linear fits. Okay, so why is this happening? We want to understand this question. And I want to make the point that, I mean, this is an extremely relevant problem actually to modern deep neural networks because they are always almost over-parameterized. Here is some examples of some, famous networks that people used for image recognition problems, and they come with millions of parameters and up to 50 million, and image data sets have about like 1 million. The biggest ones have about 1 million examples. So these networks are in the over-parameterized regime. Actually, state of the art has basically reached billions and billions of parameters. So that's this regime, and And also people have made the claim that the brain may be over-parameterized. So, I mean, there's this famous argument from back of the envelope calculation from Jeff Hinton saying, we only have about 10 to the 14 synapses, and we live about 10 to the 9 seconds. So if we were to fit all of these by some kinds of supervised learning, that would be a lot of more parameters. Just to be fair, he was arguing for unsupervised learning, that such kind of data might be coming from unsupervised learning. But other people have made the argument, in this particular quote is coming from Tony Zador, most animal behavior is not actually the result of clever learning algorithms, but innate. So which means that we must be born with highly structured connectivity, which carries all these inductive biases and enables us to learn rapidly. And I also want to emphasize this recent neuron paper by Hasson, Nastasia, and Goldstein, basically, which actually took this overparameterization idea to heart and described what its implications would be in terms of learning in the brain, and they were again making the same point. Okay, so with all this motivation, here are the questions that I want to ask and try to answer today. So what are the inductive biases of over-parameterized neural networks? What makes a function easy or hard to approximate? And by that, I will mean how many samples do you need, okay, to get a good approximation or generalization? And what are the implications of these answers I'll try to give some answers. And what are the implications of these answers for artificial and biological neural systems, and especially for neural representations? Okay. And so most of what I'm going to say is actually already on preprints, except for some stuff that I'm going to talk towards the end. And some of it is actually, one of it is actually published, and the other one is a preprint. And Blake Bordelon and Abdulkadir Janatar are two students in my group who's been working on this and the main contributors here. Okay, so let me start by trying to frame the question. How am I going to ask and answer this question? The first point I want to make is basically an obvious point. So neural networks are parameterized functions, right? So for this talk, I'm going to be thinking about feed-forward neural networks, okay? So in goes some input vector X, and out comes some output F. So this output can be a vector, but for what I'm going to show, just for simplicity, I'm going to assume that it's a scalar. Okay, but everything I say has a vector generalization. And the point is, of course, this output depends on what the input was, and also parameters of this network, right? So these are the weights and the biases of all these units here. And suppose I have n parameters, and then I give this network some p training examples or points. So p for points, that's how I remember that. And the question is, then I train this network to basically zero error, because I'm going to be thinking about some over-parameterized regime, and n is greater than d. So p, I'm likely to fit all these points to zero error, and then ask what kind of function this network has learned and how well does it generalize on a task. So schematically, let's think about what's happening over here, right? So let this slide basically represent my n-dimensional parameter space. What that means is every point on this space corresponds to a function that this network is able to represent, right? So in particular, this theta 0 here is my initial condition. That's how I initialize my neural network, okay? And I have p points and parameters. So I'll be speaking in a hand wave manner here. So that basically means my solution space. So that's basically p nonlinear equations to fit with n parameters, which means my solution space will be perhaps an n minus p dimensional solution space. And that's basically this low dimensional space over here. And then I start this training procedure, which means I give this network a loss, and then maybe I do gradient descent or something. And this learning algorithm basically brings me to a point on this particular solution space. Now, I could have gone to other points, but I went to this point, right? And this point is going to have some generalization properties, which may or may not be better than the other neighboring points or other points in the solution space. Okay, so what that means is this idea of an inductive bias is a function of basically all the ingredients that goes into this picture. So it's the properties of this function space, the kinds of functions this network is able to fit or explain or generate. And then and whatever it is that makes me go from this theta 0 to the point on the solution space, which are basically the loss function, the learning algorithm, and other tricks I might do. So just from this, I mean, it's a very, I'm just trying to make the point that this is a complicated problem to solve to understand this inductive bias idea. We have to understand all of these things, right? It's not an easy problem. Okay, so what do we do? Do we leave everything and just move on to something else or not? So it turns out, I mean, there have been some recent developments in the theory of deep learning, which allowed some simplifications in understanding this whole thing, which allowed me to ask these questions and come up with answers. So let me try to tell you what those simplifications were. So it turns out, I mean, if you take a particular limit of these feed-forward neural networks, all this procedure that I've described of training and initializing and so on and so forth simplifies and can be analyzed in some cases analytically. Okay, and the particular limit goes like this. So I'm not, okay, so basically I take every, the number of units in each hidden layer to infinity. So that's one aspect of it. So this infinite width, I'll call this the infinite width limit, but it actually involves 3 ingredients. One is this idea of taking the width to infinity. The second one is basically initializing my neural network with some kind of a random connectivity. And in this case, a particular random connectivity. I'll choose each initialization with each weight sampled from a Gaussian with 0 mean, and this 1 over NL, L being the number of neurons in the presynaptic layer, a variance. And this is a common kind of initialization we study in neuroscience, our sort of randomly connected neural networks too. So it's not very unfamiliar to us. And the third ingredient is basically how you train this. If we train this gradient descent, this network with a gradient descent on a quadratic loss. So if you put all of these things, 3 things together, it turns out you can actually simplify the whole complexity of this training and the solution space of this procedure, which I'm going to describe now in some heuristics, in a heuristic manner. But I want to make the point that everything I'm going to say has rigorous sort of proofs put first by Jaco and collaborators in 2018, and then these other authors made significant contributions to this theory. Okay, so to motivate what it is that simplifies, so here's a numerical experiment that these authors from Google Brain, I think majority are, put together. So what's being plotted here is on the y-axis is the change. So this is a deep neural network. It's trained on a task with the square loss and gradient descent. And theta 0 corresponds to basically initial configuration of the synaptic weights, showed by sampled from this Gaussian distribution. And theta t corresponds to the synaptic weights after training. Okay, so I'm basically this NF is for Frobenius norm, and I'm quantifying basically the change in synaptic weights, the total Frobenius norm of the change in synaptic weights to the initial one. And on the x-axis is basically the width parameter. So that's basically how wide or how many neurons I put per layer. And you're seeing various curves here that correspond to different layers of this neural network. But the point is that it's decreasing as a function of width. Okay, so the idea that relatively the synaptic weights move little compared to their initialization as you keep adding more and more and more neurons per width. Okay, so this is an interesting finding, and as I said, it's actually rigorous to prove that this should be happening in the infinite width limit. But we can use this idea to basically come up with some simplification of what's happening in all of this training procedure. So again, let me give you some heuristic, a few steps of the derivation of the main result of these papers. So we can start. So suppose our goal was to train our network on these P examples, and we have this loss, a squared loss. So Y mu corresponds to the desired output, and Fx mu is the output of the network to the muth example. Mu is the example index. And the particular training procedure we do is gradient flow. So the derivative of the synaptic weights or the parameters. Sorry, this should have been a theta here. These should have been thetas. Go like the gradient or the negative of the gradient of the loss. I can change this all into a differential equation for the change of the network's output function, not just the weight. So I can take how the df over dt changes, and that's by chain rule given by this. So that's the whole thing. So this next step is basically the approximation that I'm going to do. Since the weights change not much, perhaps I could approximate my neural network's output, or how that output changes as a function of weights, by basically a Taylor expansion around the initial point. I want to note that this linearization is in the synaptic weights. Okay, the network's dependence on x is still nonlinear, so this is still a nonlinear dependence on inputs. But I'm changing. I'm using this observation that weights don't change much. And then basically, when you plug this linearization into these equations and take it to zero training error, I'll spare you the few lines of algebra over here. Basically, you come up with an analytical solution to the trained network's output. Okay, so and that's given by this formula over here, and the formula has an important ingredient in it, and that I want to emphasize, and that's going to be the whole story, sort of the hero of this talk. Okay, so what goes into this formula? So first, basically, this y is a vector of desired outputs. So that's what this is. So this KNTK is called the neural tangent kernel. Okay, and it's basically given by this formula. So it's a dot product of the gradients of the network's output with respect to the parameters evaluated at the initial point. Okay, so it's neural because this has to do with the neural network. It's tangent because I'm dealing with gradients over here. And it's a kernel because it's a dot product of two sort of feature vectors. And this kernel aspect, I'll talk more about that in a second. So if that's not the main thing I want to give away now. But that's basically what goes into this thing. And the evaluate, so I could define this K object with respect to any pairs of inputs. But what goes into this formula is basically the kernel gram matrix that is evaluated at the training examples. Okay, and the lastly, there's the small k over here, which has basically, it's a vector. It's again this k NTK, the NTK kernel over here, but it's two parameters. One is fixed to the training examples, and the other one is free. So this is any input. So I want to emphasize that this particular sort of formula is the network's prediction to any input given a part of given set of training examples, which are indexed by mu. Okay, so this was sort of an intuitive way to get to this result, but I mean, there are rigorous results that prove sort of this approximation is true in the infinite width limit, and this is exact. Okay, but so what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to study this formula in more detail. But before doing that, let me, because the key ingredient of it is going to be this object neural tangent kernel, let me try to give you an intuition of what that looks like. Okay. So actually, this is something that we are familiar with from neuroscience literature. So if it is the case that we have this whole neural network, and what we do is we fix most of it, and we only train the last layer. Okay. So in that case, you can just do the algebra. This basically KNTK looks like a dot product of the neural representations with respect to two particular stimuli, maybe so two inputs x and x prime. And this is basically one version of this representational similarity matrix that we use and to quantify representations. In the coming minutes, I'll make the point that this inductive bias has to do with this kernel, okay? Therefore, I haven't made the point yet, but I'll make the point. Therefore, if the population code is sort of static, meaning that network is not changing and we're only training or learning from some fixed representation, I will be making the point that this representational similarity matrix captures full information about inductive bias. But of course, if we allow for changes of weights over the whole network, okay, then basically we get some corrections to this. It's not just the representation at the last layer, but basically derivatives of the network's output with respect to parameters in earlier layers also contribute to this object. So we get some corrections. Then representational similarity matrix or these representations at the last layer are not the only relevant quantities for inductive bias. Okay, so I just received a question, so let me read it and try to answer. Alex Dimitrov is asking, or answering maybe. Okay, so there was a question about T. So T, yes, this T was about continuous training time. I'm considering gradient flow over here. Okay, and I'm not going to give you the particular formula for it, but this object is actually analytically calculable for infinitely wide networks in the particular limit that I described. Okay, so we'll make use of that in a second. Okay, so this is what this object is about. It's about taking derivatives of the output with respect to parameters. Okay, now what I want to do is I'm going to describe a total different problem in one slide, and then I want you to just shift focus to this one, and I'll make the connection back to this tangent kernel stuff in a second. And this problem is about the problem of kernel regression. So I'll give you a technical definition, and I'll make it more concrete in a second. But the problem goes like this. It's a regression problem. I'm trying to learn a function from a finite number of observations. This function lives on a Hilbert space. It's technically reproducing kernel Hilbert space with a Hilbert inner product. Okay. If you don't know what this is, do not worry. I'll give you a more intuitive version in a second, but I just need to make a technical point now. And I can ask this problem of regression by having a training set with, again, P examples. And then basically the problem is given by this. Find a function that approximates these examples, subject to some regularization. I put my regularization parameter in front of the cost, not to the regularizer for some other historical reasons. But anyway, and the point is that this function has to be within this reproducing kernel Hilbert space. Okay, so if you don't know what this RKHS is, it's basically a space with lots of smoothness constraints. So not any, for example, square integrable functions are not is not an RKHS. But again, I'll give you a more technical, more intuitive definition in a second. The reason I'm trying to I'm emphasizing this is basically this problem also has a unique solution. Okay, and that unique solution has a formula that looks very much like the previous problem that I described to you. So it has this Y transpose that goes into it. It has this K thing, a kernel that belongs, this kernel now is an object that is a property of this reproducing kernel Hilbert space. They come with these kernels, okay, that goes into it. And this lambda parameter goes into this, and it's a minus sign, and it's exactly this small k exactly as before, okay? So the point I'm trying to make is the following, okay? So in kernel regression, we get this formula for the prediction of that regression procedure, the predictor that comes out of this regression procedure for a new function. And this infinite width neural network that trained with gradient flow gives me this other formula, which look almost identical up to this lambda over here. So what I'm going to do now is basically, I'm going to try to understand how this inductive bias works in the kernel regression problem, which is a more general problem. I'll do this with some statistical mechanics, okay? And then basically, if I want to apply this to neural networks in the infinite width limit, I'll just take this lambda goes to 0 limits, and that's going to give me insight about trained neural networks. Okay, so that's what's going to happen here. One technical point I need to make here is, of course, so in kernel regression, this object kernel needs to obey certain properties, and this K and TK obeys those properties, but that's a technical discussion, and I'm not going to go there. So this sort of match is valid. All right. Okay. Now let's go back to the idea of so what this kernel regression and kernel RKHS reproducing kernel Hilbert space ideas by me that wasn't available from this infinite width limit that I've taken. Okay. So I talked to you about this kernel object, and I talked to you about that there must be a function space that these neural networks, operate with as a function of their parameters. We can understand that actually from this kernel Hilbert, reducing kernel Hilbert space point of view, and that goes like this. And here's another sort of more intuitive definition of the same object, RKHS. So you can take this object, K and Tk. Now it has two parameters, so x and x prime. It's symmetric. So you can think of this as basically a continuous version of a symmetric matrix, okay? And you can come up with an eigenvalue problem for it, okay? So that's how it goes. So K and Tk goes here. It's going to be any kernel. So we can also introduce a distribution for x, a measure for x, which I'll take to be a data distribution. And these phi's are eigen functions, okay? And there's an eigenvalue equation I can write for this, okay? And which comes with a lambda k and phi k on the other side, okay? So there's a name for this. This is called a Mercer decomposition. But the point is the following. Like the eigenvectors of, let's say, Hermitian matrices, okay? The eigenfunctions here form a basis, a complete basis for the function space, okay? And we can define that any function in this RKHS to be basically a linear combination of these phi's. And the whole space is going to be defined by functions with finite norm. And that norm we're going to define by basically squares of these coefficients divided by lambda k being the eigenvalue over here. So if that norm is less than infinity, okay, this is the space of functions that this NTK, so this eigen functions of this kernel object span. And the reason I want to say this is I want to use this idea to turn this network into basically an expansion, that network's output into an expansion in this basis. So I'm going to think of what goes into this network X and that what comes out as a function F in the limit of infinite width, okay? The functions that this network can represent as a function of now these W's, that these W's are different than the thetas that were initial parameters of the network, basically as linear combinations of these eigenfunctions of the tangent kernel of this neural network, okay? So, and notice that everything about the network architecture and so on and so forth also goes into these definitions of what these weights are. And also, I can think of basically a target function, the function that I want to estimate or produce or basically or learn from examples from. So I'll note that by a t, and that function is going to come with a different set of weights in this space. Okay, so I'm going to reduce all of this network training and so on and so forth to basically finding coefficients of functions in some kind of a basis. So just to make the connection again to maybe stuff that we're also more familiar about analyzing neural data. So again, let's go back to this this particular case of recording from or training on the last layer and the rest of the network is static, okay? And we are looking at representations. So this is basically some data from Cengiz and colleagues, and this was a mouse looking at gratings with different orientations, and this is basically responses of each time you use a response of neurons to different angular orientations of that grating. So one thing analyzing such data, one thing we do is commonly do is PCA analysis, right? So we look at this data and do a PCA on it. So this basically boils down to doing forming a matrix R, which is number of neurons by number of, let's say, stimuli, and doing an SVD on it. Okay, so the left singular vectors is what goes into that PCA analysis, and the eigenfunctions that I'm talking about are basically the right singular vectors. So this is the thing that actually is going to be the important ingredient in my analysis over here. W bars are not unique, right? So there was a question about W bars. So W bars are going to be, so this is going to be a target function that my examples come from. So yes, it will be unique in the sense that I chose it, and I can choose it to be anything I want. So okay, that hopefully that answers your question. But for a particular data set, it will be unique. I'll give you an example of this in a second. Okay. So here's another example of what this function set looks like. And this one is actually analytically solvable example of these neural tangent kernels calculated from fully and randomly connected networks in the infinite limit, width limit. So if we assume that the data lives on a d-dimensional sphere, that's obviously a very constrained data set, but we can analyze this. It turns out these eigenfunctions are spherical harmonics, okay, so which makes sense. So this is a depiction of spherical harmonics in a two-dimensional spheres, basically. So spherical harmonics come with two indices, a degree and an order. So this is how, and the color code here shows you the value that this object ykm takes, and k goes this way and m goes this way. So you can think of this k and m as some kind of complexity here. As k increases, you get more and more higher frequency components appearing in your functions. And we can also calculate these eigenvalues using some kind of numerics in this case. So the point of this slide is that we can calculate some of this analytically, which will be useful in a second. Okay, so to recapitulate what I've said, here are 2 points of view. So here's sort of the standard neural network point of view at the top. In goes x, there are some parameters, and out goes some f. I can basically take the width limit to infinity and calculate this tangent kernel and then calculate these eigenfunctions. And I can turn this whole problem of network fitting to a problem of basically a linear regression in a feature space. Okay, where this feature space is basically obtained by passing x's through these eigenfunctions of the kernel. And so the first layer of this sort of architecture is static, and what needs to be learned is this W. Now, the relation between W and these networks sort of weights are not trivial, they are complicated. But the idea is that the learned function and its predictions we can analyze in this setting and should apply to that setting. And I'll show you examples of that just coming now. Okay. All right, so now technically, let me tell you what is the particular problem we solved after all the setup. And so this will be basically a bunch of technical slides, and then I'll give you the result. So the technical problem is the following. So we're given some P examples from this target function corrupted with some noise, okay? And then what we want to do is we want to calculate the generalization error due to from a function solving this optimizing this kernel regression problem. And the generalization error is defined by the difference between the optimal sort of solution here compared to the target function, not only on the training examples, but over the whole data set. Right? Obviously, this is going to, not only the P training examples, but all examples I could test this function from. Okay, so obviously this is going to depend on the number of samples. As you add more and more samples, you should be getting a better and better answer. Okay, so you can write the whole thing in terms of these in the eigenfunction space, and life simplifies. So basically, in the space of W's and W bars, this average basically boils down to just a comparison of the vectors of W star and W bar, W star being the weights of the optimal solution. And this whole thing is basically the kernel regression equation written in this eigenbasis, basically with respect to the weights. So what we do is basically we take this. So we set up a statistical mechanics problem. So just briefly, what happens is, so this is the function, or the like the energy function that we're trying to minimize, kernel regression. We put this into basically a Gibbs distribution with some temperature parameters, 1 over data, and then introduce that generalization error as a source term, and then basically follow the standard statistical mechanics procedures of calculating generalization error by taking the derivative of this, the log of the partition function with respect to source term and taking the limit beta goes to infinity, or the zero temperature. Of course, one complication here is that the data set that we are averaging over, creates some problems, because this is you can think of this as a quench disorder of the system, and that makes life hard. And luckily, physicists have developed many a few methods to deal with this. So experience from study of disordered systems suggests that the free energy is self-averaging in the limit number of points go to infinity. So therefore, we can actually calculate the typical behavior of the system by performing an average of the free energy over all possible data sets. So what I'm basically describing is a replica trick. So this is just for the experts over there. That's what we use. But the bottom line is, after a lot of calculations, we end up with a formula. Okay, and the formula looks like this. Okay, and there's nothing particular about it, except that I want to show you that there's a formula. And it actually looks surprisingly simple compared to other, if you have any experience with dealing with these methods, fine. But the thing I want to point to here is what goes into this formula are these eigenvalues of the kernel. So everything about the network's architecture, layers, and so on and so forth is in that. So P is this other variable that's basically how many samples that you have. And sigma here is basically another variable that is about how much noise you added to the problem. Okay. So this set of equations turn out to have a lot of rich phenomenology and can explain quite a few phenomena. And so I'll try to go over a few of these depending on how much time I have. So the first point I want to make is this theory actually applies to real data sets. Okay. So we can actually predict test or training and test errors in real data sets like MNIST, CFAR, so whatever we try and works. Okay. So the way it goes is like the following. So remember, to make this theory work, I have to solve this eigenvalue equation, eigenfunction equation. So suppose I have a data set like MNIST, so that has basically 60,000 images in it. So how do I apply this theory? Well, I can define basically a uniform distribution over this data set. That's basically a 1 over m being the number of examples, okay, and a delta function distribution, and plug that in here. So this will correspond to a procedure that I choose my samples randomly and uniformly over the full data set, and I test over the whole data set. And then basically this whole thing boils down to a matrix eigenvalue problem. Okay, it's actually a kernel PCA problem. And I can read the eigenvalues from this problem, solving this problem. And so that was one of the ingredients that I need to have for my theory. And the second ingredient was basically what do I do with the target function? That's what I have to express my target function in this basis tool. And that can also be easily be done. So the target function in this case corresponds to a map from basically each x vector to a label 1 or -1. Right, so that I can also basically project directly to this basis and read out target weights. So I get these two ingredients and plug into my theory, and I get a curve. And then I go to a computer and I either train a neural network or do the kernel regression problem, and then test on test data and see how that thing performs and compare to my theory. So here, the solid lines are our theory, and the dotted lines are, so the circles are experiments, and the error bars are here are basically errors due to different sort of data sets, because we train this with a particular data set. Okay, so we can do this for I don't know, some made up data sets like a Gaussian kernel and Gaussian measure data is coming from a Gaussian distribution, or we can do this with real data sets and NIST. So in this case, actually, we're plotting our theory. The prediction of these triangles are what the kernel regression problem gives us, and the circles are basically experiments from a neural network which has 3 layers, and each layer has 800 neurons in it. And there's a remarkable match between those things too. And we test this on all sorts of data sets and all sorts of kernels, including the ones that come from deep networks, and everything seems to work. So that's point 1. So that's very nice. so what that means is we can use to get some insight about what this problem that I asked about, right? The inductive bias, the bias towards simple functions and what that means. Okay, so because of the way this problem is set up, it turns out we can decompose the total generalization error into each spectral mode, meaning error in this dimension that corresponds to the first eigenfunction and error to the second one, and so on and so forth. So EK corresponds to errors in each of these modes. And then you can prove that basically if the relative decrease in error in modes corresponding to higher eigenvalues are faster or than relative decrease in modes corresponding to lower eigenvalues. So what that means is this network is basically going to fit, okay, top components of the top eigenfunction components of the target function first, and then proceed to the next and next ones. This is a bit abstract, but here's a particular example. Okay, so let's see how this whole thing works. So suppose I took a neural network and I gave it a bunch of zeros and ones, and then I gave it a bunch of 8s and 9s. These are two different experiments. And I'm asking it, to basically generalize or solve this problem, learn zeros from ones or 8s from 9s. So which one is harder or which one is an easier problem? Okay. So when I ask this to people, everybody says, oh, zeros and ones is easier because, one has a circular feature and then one is a sort of zero has a circular features and one is straight, and, it looks more easily separable. True, to us, certainly it does. It looks like this. But is it easier for a neural network to solve this? And if so, why? Does our theory give any insight? First point, yes, it is. So here is the training error as a function of sample size, how many examples I show. This is for a 3-layer network. The line is again the theory, and the dots are basically experiments. And you see that the orange curve corresponding to 0-1 separation is basically below the blue curve, meaning it learns this faster. So why is it that this is faster? So we can now go ahead and take our data set and look at these eigenfunctions. So what I'm plotting here is the following. Each point here, circle or cross, corresponds to a data point. It's either 0 or 1. So red points are zeros and blue points are ones. So this is what the on the x-axis is basically phi1. This is the value that this data point takes on this eigenfunction, okay? And this is the value that this data point takes on the second eigenfunction. And this is, on the right is the same plot plotted for this 8 versus 9 case, okay? And so what you're seeing here is the 0 versus 1 case is already very well separated in these top two eigen basis functions. And 8 versus 9 is not so well separated, okay? And combined with our theoretical result that these networks start to learn on the top eigenfunctions, okay? It's natural to expect that basically, this is easier and will be learned faster because most of the information that you need are already in the top eigenmodes. And here's another way to plot the same thing. So what we're plotting here on the x-axis is basically the power. Okay, so there's a target function that comes with assigning these zeros and ones to correct labels, so that we can again project to the eigenbasis, and there's these coefficients. So this is the cumulative power in these coefficients as a function of the degree or the order of the eigenfunction. And you see that most of the power for this 0-1 separation is on the top eigenvalues and eigenfunctions, and for this other one, basically it's not. So basically, this 0-1 separation is easier because I can explain that with a smaller number of eigenfunctions of the kernel eigenvalue. Okay, so that's basically a story about spectral bias. Let me give you another example of this. So here's another example of this. It's an extreme example in the sense that what I'm training now is again a neural network, and in this case, the inputs are chosen to be, the target functions are, so inputs are chosen to be uniformly distributed on a sphere, and the target functions are composed of basically spherical harmonics. Okay, I studied this example because we can analytically solve this in great detail. I'm not going to go through the details of that discussion, but I'll give you the result. Okay. So, but we're doing particular things here. So that these target functions come in variety. So I make them only include a particular kind of k. So I remember this k was the degree of the spherical harmonic here. So I think of it as basically containing only a particular kind of spectral content. As k increases, I have functions with higher and higher order, let's say, frequencies, and for k low, basically more dull functions. Okay. And then what I'm trying to, I'm giving these functions and the example that I sample from these functions to the same network, and I'm asking their generalization error. So on the y-axis, this is basically this generalization error. And on the x-axis is how many samples that I gave it to this network. And k corresponds to the particular target function. So k7 means the examples were coming from this very high degree spherical harmonics, and k equal to 1 will be just a very low sort of a frequency kind of a spherical harmonic. So the thing I'm trying to make here is, and D is 15, so it's a 15-dimensional data set. Okay, so the same network starts learning the low degree function with about 15 samples. But by the time the function has only second degree harmonics, I have to go up to basically 100, 150 or something samples to start learning. And by the time, so when I'm looking at this a k equal to 7 target function, even if I've seen 10 to the 4, 10,000 samples, we haven't learned anything at all. And the reason is basically the network is trying to explain this this data still with lower order harmonics. There's a particular ordering, and the turn hasn't come to actually 7th order harmonics yet. So basically, you have to wait all the way there. In this particular case, actually, we can prove that the separation of scales here, so the vertical lines here correspond to when these separate curves are going to turn around. And we can prove that in the limit that d goes high, these are going to be d times spaced apart. Basically, the first d examples, roughly, you're going to be fitting the first k modes. The second d examples, you're going to be fitting the second k modes, and so on and so forth. Okay, so, and yeah, we can show the same thing with neural networks too. Okay, so let me conclude by just saying a few things about how you would apply this to representations in the brain. Okay, so we're at the era where we can record from maybe tens of thousands of neurons at the same time, and we can form these. We can, in this particular case, there was a mouse. This is data coming from this paper by Stringer et al. And looking at sometimes drifting, sometimes static gratings with different orientations, and then they were recording from these 20,000 neurons. And we can think of a scenario where there's a downstream neuron looking at this population and trying to learn something from it. So that something can be basically trying to tell a particular orientation or discriminate two different orientations or something like this. So then we can ask the question, how many examples of such things you need to see to be able to come up with a good representation, and whether your population code, what is the inductive bias of your population code? What kind of functions does it allow you to learn faster and not? So we can exactly do what we've said. We can take this population code and calculate the representational similarity matrix, which is basically a dot product of the neural responses to these of the population of the two different, let's say, orientations in this case. I mean, representations have high structure in this case, so you get basically a highly structured similarity matrix. You can, so we're considering this scenario, we are just reading out from the population code here. And we can calculate basically all these things that I've told you. So you can calculate the eigenvalue spectrum of this kernel. You can calculate the eigenfunctions or eigenvectors of this kernel as a function of theta. Here they are basically shifted a bit apart just to for visualization, and it turns out they look like Fourier modes, which are sort of not surprising. The lower ones correspond to higher eigenvalues, which means that if I were to read out from this sort of suppose a task where I'm going to classify, let's say, the output of these gratings to a label +1 or -1, and that can be basically passing a cosine function from a sine, or cosine 5 times the orientation through a sine, which obviously includes higher Fourier modes, right? So it will take a much smaller number of examples to get this right than get that right. And that's exactly what's being shown here. If I were to read out this from this population node by basically a biologically plausible delta rule kind of thing, I will be able to learn much faster a low frequency readout than a higher frequency readout, and precisely because more of the power will be concentrated on the high eigenvalue content of the kernel eigenvalues. Okay, so with that, here's some closing thoughts. What I tried to tell you was neural networks are biased towards simple functions. So simple in this case theoretically meant, or this is the answer I tried to give, composed of the high eigenvalue eigenfunctions of the neural tangent kernel. So it's a lot of words, but this is the result. So inductive bias is a function of network architecture, weights, and learning rules. For a wide network, all of these are factored into the spectrum of the neural tangent kernel, and all of the spectrum is important. Okay, not just the tail, and this is for there are other. Okay, so that's what it is. Our theory works remarkably well. Okay. But it does also need to be extended to more biologically plausible versions of the network architecture and weights and learning rules. Representational similarity matrices are useful for describing static population codes from information as readouts, but when learning also adapts intermediate representations, a more complicated similarity matrix is needed to basically elucidate inductive bias. And overall, understanding recordings from large populations of neurons is a theoretical challenge, what you do with them. Perhaps this function space and kernel point of view can help formulate new questions, if not answer them. And finally, I want to acknowledge all people in my group and my funding resources, and especially Blake and Abdul, who are spearheading this project.